Right. Welcome back, everyone, to Author Story. I am your host, Alexander Lim, and our guest for today is Paul Smith, author of this episode's featured book, The 10 Stories Great Leaders Tell, which you can check out by clicking on the Amazon link in the video description below. Paul is one of the world's leading experts on organizational storytelling, is a best-selling author of several books, and his work has been featured in such publications as Time and the Wall Street Journal. So, Paul, welcome to Author Story. Thank you very much for being with us.
Yeah, Alex, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Cool, cool. So, first off, Paul, a little bit about yourself. What was it like for you growing up as Paul? Did you like follow the usual path of the middle class, like school and work and all that stuff before you became a storyteller?
Yeah, definitely. In fact, my corporate career was pretty typical. I mean, I never imagined myself as an author and a speaker. My dad was a businessman, and growing up, I kind of thought that's what responsible adult men were supposed to do, was to go get a job in the business world somewhere. And so I studied economics in college and got a master's degree in business, and worked as a consultant for a couple of years for a company that's now called Accenture, and then spent 20 years at the Procter and Gamble company. So one of the world's largest companies, I suppose, and and increasing levels of management there. And
Right.
but yeah, so none of that would have suggested that I would end up as an author and a storyteller. No.
Right, right. And what got you started on this road to being a storyteller? I mean, what got you from like the executive track, so to speak, and now you're doing storytelling?
Yeah, I think I just became obvious to me, and I got fascinated with this concept of storytelling. It became obvious that it was an important skill set for leaders to have. So the leaders that I admired the most inside Procter and Gamble, and the ones I wanted to be like, and the ones that I wanted to work for, and grow up and emulate when I got more senior in the company, had this great ability to tell stories. And that frustrated me because I didn't know how to do that. And they didn't teach me that in undergrad. They didn't teach me
Right,
that in business school. They
right,
didn't teach me that when I joined these companies. And
right.
so I kind of set out on my own little learning journey to figure out how. And that's what eventually led to my first book on the topic.
All right, great. So, storytelling, as you mentioned, this is what you're presently doing. This is your present forte. So, just for the sake of our listeners, just define terms. What exactly is storytelling?
Yeah, so the definition I use is similar to the one any 10-year-old kid would tell you. I mean, it's when you're telling somebody about something that happened to someone. Okay, so
Okay,
maybe in more grown-up language, it's a narrative. It's a narrative about something that happened. So to me, a story is not a speech or a presentation or a memo or a message track. I mean, people use the word story for all kinds of things today.
right,
But when I say a story, I literally mean a narrative that has a time, a place, a main character. That main character has a goal. There's usually someone or something getting in the way of that goal. There are events that transpire along the way and hopefully resolve themselves nicely in the end. So, it's the kind of thing that would follow, once upon a time something happened.
right.
As opposed to, look, Alex, if you want to be successful in this company, there are three things you got to do. And then now I'm going to tell you what those three things are. Well, that's not a story.
Hmm.
That's a piece of advice, right? That's a list. So a story to me is a real narrative about something that happened.
And by story, we're talking about something that's structured. It's got a beginning, it's got a middle, it's got an end, rather than just a list of, as you mentioned, a list of things to do or stuff like that.
Right. In fact, in the last chapter of the book, I lay out a little bit more explicit structure than beginning, middle, end. But yeah, you're right. There is a beginning, middle, and end. What I tell people is there are 8 questions that I think your story needs to answer, and in a particular order. And if you answer those 8 questions, you'll end up with a story in the proper structure.
Okay, so these 8 questions, can you just, if you don't want to tell all 8, don't want to give everything away, can you tell us
No,
one
no.
or two of them, or you can tell them all 8 if you want.
Yeah, yeah. I'll tell you all 8. Yeah, it's not a secret. So the first question you have to answer is, why should I listen to the story? So you're answering this question for your audience. So you need to give your audience a reason to listen to your story. Otherwise, they might not, right? But once you've answered that question adequately, you've kind of earned the right to answer the next 5 questions. So here those are. Where and when did it take place? Who's the main character and what did they want? What was the problem or opportunity that they ran into? What did they do about it? And how did it turn out in the end? Right? That should sound like the natural flow of a story, and it is, but that's only, if you're keeping track, that's only 6, right? So there's 2 more questions. Right? So the last 2 are, what did you learn from the story? And what do you think I should go do now? Me, the audience member. What do you, the storyteller, think I should go do now? So that's your opportunity to make a recommendation. So you're basically at the front, you're giving them a reason to listen to your story and get them interested. So I call that the hook. Then the next 5 are the main body of the story. Where and when did it happen? Who's the main character? What happened? Then at the end, you're concluding with the lesson that they should have learned and what they a recommendation. So if you answer those 8 questions in that order for a business story, you're likely to get what you want, and what's going to come out of your mouth is going to be in the natural, I think, flow of a story.
Okay, and as you mentioned, the storytelling that you mentioned here in your book, this is essentially business communication. This is different from, like, say, a best-selling novel. Am I correct?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, in general, all storytelling, shares some common traits. I mean, all of them are going to have that main character. That main character is going to have a goal. There's going to be a problem or opportunity they ran into. There's going to be some action of what they did to resolve that problem. There will be how did it turn out in the end? That's the resolution of the story. So, yeah, even a novel or a movie, they're all going to have similar features. Now, at the end of a movie, they typically don't summarize it with what should you have learned and what should you go do now. And in a business story, you typically will, or you'll have the audience summarize that for you to find out what they think they learned or what they want to go do now. Because in business, you're telling stories not just to entertain people, but to accomplish some kind of an objective, right? You're trying to lead them, or you're trying to sell them something, or get them to do their job better. So you have an objective more than just entertainment.
Okay, all right. Now, I read somewhere recently that storytelling is becoming a popular means of communication in companies. I mean, I think I saw 3M, Nike, and heck, even Procter and Gamble. It's becoming a method of communication. Why is this so? I mean, compared to like just issuing a memo or something like that.
Well, I think the main reason, of course, is that it just works. It works better at helping people or at getting people to think or feel or do whatever it is that you want them to do. So if you're the leader and you're or a marketer or salesperson or whatever, and you're trying to influence what people think, feel, and do, which I call leadership in general, it turns out stories are just uniquely well qualified for that. And the reason is because stories communicate with both parts of your brain. Whereas when you just tell people what to do, or tell them what to think, or give them a list of reasons to do something, or when you're just talking at them, you're only speaking to the logical, rational, conscious thinking part of the brain. But it turns out that many, if not most, human decisions are made in a more subconscious, emotional processing part of the brain. And then their brain rationalizes that decision a few nanoseconds later. So we all leave decisions thinking we made them for rational, logical reasons, but the truth is our kind of subconscious reptilian brain decided for us a few seconds earlier.
Right.
And so if you want to influence people better, you need to talk to both parts of the brain. Either one or the other is not good enough. And stories do a much better job of reaching the more subconscious, emotional part of the brain, and lists of reasons, to do things only reach the logical part of the brain.
Right. So I'm just curious. Do you have any data on how effective this is? Like, before it was like this, and afterwards with storytelling it was like this. Just curious.
Yeah, so I wish I could give you better. I can give you some numbers, but it's hard to quantify storytelling because it would be a rare situation for a company to not do any storytelling and then all of a sudden decide now we're going to start doing storytelling and we're not going to change anything else about the way we run our business, right? So there's never a single variable test that goes on with storytelling, but there have been studies that show that facts and data are somewhere between 6 and 22 times more likely to be remembered if those facts are embedded in a story than if they're just given to people in a list. Right. So at a minimum, you can say that stories make the facts that you're sharing much more likely to be remembered. And if they can't be remembered, they can't be acted on, of course.
Of course, of course. Okay, cool. So, Paul, now onto the book. I mean, you've written books on leading and selling with stories, and this one's all about the stories that leaders would tell. Was writing it something which kind of grew over the years, or was there something that happened that made you think, I should write about this?
Yeah, so there were definitely a couple of things that happened. One is the three books that I'd written previously, which is Lead with a Story, Parenting with a Story, and Sell with a Story. I counted up, and I think there were 70 different types of stories that I talked about in those books, and over 250 examples of these types of stories. So if I could be accused of anything, it would be being too thorough, right? That's just a lot of stories. And so I often have people ask me, okay, gosh, Paul, well, what are the most important ones, And I would always just, if somebody asked me that, I would give them an answer. Oh, well, here's these 2 or 3 are really important. And then the next day, somebody else would ask me the same question, and I'd probably give them a different answer. And the truth is, I just hadn't thought about it very much about, which ones are the most important. So I was looking for an opportunity to focus and help people prioritize what are the most important ones.
Right.
And then I just happened to get a call from a different publisher, who wanted me to write a book on storytelling that could be read in a single hour. And as opposed to a normal size book that might take you 8 or 10 or 12 hours to read. And that's the more practical reason. And I immediately thought, oh, well, that's the perfect opportunity to write a short book with just the 10 most important stories instead of the 70 different types of stories that I've been trafficking in, until that point. So those two things coming together is what made it happen.
Okay, cool. So I got then the need to cut down the number of stories in a book. I mean, to make it readable in an hour. Why write a book in particular on stories that leaders would tell?
Well, because I think a lot of journalists and people who interview me on shows like this, they're usually mostly interested in how to teach us how to craft these stories. And quite frankly, that's what I spend most of my professional life doing, and most of the books I write are to teach people how to craft these stories. But the truth is, the more important question is, well, which stories do I need to tell? And my better clients know that already. In fact, they'll ask me, what stories do I need to tell, instead of, now, Paul, come teach me how to tell these stories. So I feel like that's the first question you need to ask, is figure out what stories to tell, then figure out how to tell them.
Okay, and of course, leadership. I mean, there are different kinds of stories that different people can tell. I mean, like a business leader would want to tell a different kind of story from, say, someone who's like working in a car dealership or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So this one is for leaders. So this clearly, I've got a whole book on storytelling for salespeople called Sell with a Story, but this one is for leaders of any functional discipline. By the way, you could be a sales leader. But this is for somebody that's a mid to senior level executive for sure.
Okay, cool. So the book is 10 Stories Great Leaders Tell. What are these 10 stories, or 10 kinds of stories? Can you tell us what these are?
Yeah, so here's the list. So again, the list isn't a secret either. So the first 4 go together because they're about setting direction for the organization. So the first one is where we came from. So that's our founding story.
Okay.
The second one is why we can't stay there. So that's a case for change story.
Okay.
The next one is where we're going, a vision story. And the fourth one is how we're going to get there, which is a strategy story. Because a strategy is all about how you're going to get from where you are to where you want to be. So I think if leaders can tell those stories, they've got a much better chance of getting the organization to go where they want them to go, because they can easily and in a compelling way articulate where we came from, why we can't stay there, where we're going, and how we're going to get there. Does that make sense?
Yep. And
all right.
The other stories?
Yeah. So the next 4 kind of go together as well, but they're more about who we are as an organization. So number 5 is what we believe. So that's a corporate values story. 6 is who we serve. So that's a customer story, or a story about your customer. 7 is what we do for our customers. So that's kind of a classical sales story or a customer success story.
Right.
And then number 8 is how we're different from our competitors. And I call that a marketing story because I think the job of marketing is to differentiate yourself from your competitors. So Again, those four kind of go together, and you can imagine if you can tell those stories, it's easy to be able to tell people who you are, who you work for, what you do for them, and how you're different from your competitors. And I think every functional leader needs to be able to tell those stories about the company that they, are helping to lead.
Right.
Make sense?
Yep.
All right. That's 8. So there are 2 left, and they're a little bit more personal to the leader. So number 9 is why I lead the way I do. So that's a personal leadership philosophy story. And number 10 is why you should want to work here. And so you being the person that the leader's talking to. So it's a recruiting story. And that's important because I think it's the job of every leader to bring in talented people into the organization and have them want to stay, right? So it's not just the job of HR or the recruiting department. So if you can tell those 2 stories, you'll be able to get more talented people to come work for you and have them stay and follow your leadership. So those are the 10.
Okay. All right. So just to make this a little clearer for our audience, Paul, can you give us an example of one kind of story that might be told?
Yeah. So we'll do number 9 that I just talked about, the personal leadership philosophy story. So the example here from the book is about a guy named Mike Figliolo, he was a West Point graduate in the U.S., which means he was at the U.S. Military Academy for the Army. Right. So when he graduated, he of course had to go into the military service. And one of his first leadership opportunities was leading a platoon of tanks. So he was a tank platoon leader. And I don't think he ever saw any real active combat, but in one of his first training exercises, he got his real first leadership test. And so this training exercise was essentially a game of laser tag with tanks. Okay, so it was a battle exercise with real tanks and real soldiers, but they weren't shooting real, bullets at each other. They were shooting lasers, so nobody would get hurt. But so you have to imagine this 10-mile long, 5-mile wide, practice battlefield out in California in the U.S. and 400 tanks on one side of the field and another 400 tanks on the other side of the field. Whoa. And they're gonna start going towards each other and go into the simulated laser battle. And Mike happened to be commanding the first tank on his side of the field. So his tank was going to be the first one onto the field with 399 other tanks behind him. Right. Well, so of course the night before he has to sit down with the commanding officer and figure out the battle plan and look at the map and figure out where the high ground was to get the best strategic odds of winning the battle. Right. So he does that. The next morning the exercise starts. He's in his tank. They're racing out onto the field. A minute or two into it, he has to make his first decision about whether to turn right or left. And he doesn't know what to do. And the reason is because I guess, the field, when you're looking at it through the tiny crack in the hatch on top of a tank, traveling at 40 miles an hour getting shot at, looks different than it does on a map in a conference room. Right. And so he's just confused about what to do. So he's got a choice to make. He can either stop the tank, turn the light on, get the map out, figure out what to do, and then do it, which might take, 30 seconds. Or he could just guess. Well, Mike chose option number 2. He just yells out, "Driver, turn left," in his most authoritative voice, even though the truth is he had no idea what he was doing. Okay. So driver turns left. And then within a few seconds, the light on top of his tank went off, which means you just got shot by a laser, you're dead. Okay. So they had to stop the tank, pop the hatch, the guys get out. Okay, they're done for the day, right? But then, of course, tank number 2 that's following him, they turned left also. Within a few seconds, their light goes off, they're dead. Well, tank number 3 turns left, their light goes off, they're dead. Right. But tank number 4 saw 3 tanks turn left and get shot and virtually killed. So the tank number 4 realized that was a mistake. So tank number 4 turned right, and then 396 other tanks turned right. They turned the correct way. They took the high ground and they won the exercise, right? Now, Mike learned a lesson from that experience because he made a mistake, right? He should have turned right, but he turned left, okay? Right. So that was a leadership mistake. But what he learned from it was that sometimes it's better to make the wrong decision quickly than make the right decision slowly. Because as you're trying to figure out the right thing to do, Your competition isn't standing still, right? If he had done that, if he had stopped for 30 seconds and got out the map,
Right.
there would have been 399 tanks behind him that were stopped waiting for him to look at the map, and they'd be
Right.
sitting ducks out there in the battle. It'd likely all be dead now, right? Or, virtually dead. So, and it's the same in business, right? Sometimes it's better to make the wrong decision quickly, because in life and in business and in the military, life will show you that you made a mistake pretty quickly. And then, unless it really is a life or death situation, you can probably monitor and adjust. And that might be better than being stuck for weeks or months in the analysis paralysis that we often get stuck in business. So that explains why he is the kind of leader he is today, because today he's a very decisive leader. He makes decisions quickly, but he's also a very forgiving leader. Like, if you make a mistake, he'll forgive you as long as you learn from it, right? So he tells people that story so that they will know what kind of leadership to expect from him, and so that they will follow suit and be a similar leader themselves. Right. So then the story works far better than him just saying, "Hey, I'm a very decisive leader, and I think you should be too."
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. It's not just a bullet point, cut and dry. No, I'm a decisive leader.
Right.
There's a rationale behind it. There's
Yeah.
a story behind it. All right, cool. So, Paul, I mean, there are 10 different kinds of stories to tell. I'm sure there are some which come out as uh, the worst that are told, the better ones are told. Which one among these 10 different kinds of stories is the one that tends to be the worst, to be told?
I think leaders have a hard time telling strategy stories and vision stories. And I think the reason, and it's not that they don't have a vision or don't have a strategy, they normally do. The difference is that they don't know what the difference is between a strategy and a strategy document and a strategy story, or they don't know the difference between a vision statement and a vision story. Right. So a story, like I said, it's a narrative about a time and a place where something happened. So your vision statement might be something like this: we want to be the fastest growing restaurant chain on the East Coast, or we want to be we want to invent the quietest jet engine in the industry. And that's a great vision statement, I suppose. But a vision story is something very different. A story would be you telling a narrative about what it's going to be like to work at this company 5 years from now when we've achieved that vision. And the story will be so attractive that people will want to help you achieve that vision. So there's a big difference between a strategy and a vision, and a strategy story and a vision story. Right. So I think they do better at it if they recognize that there's a difference between those two things, but most of them don't.
Okay. All right. So let me go to the flip side of this one. What are the best stories what are the stories that are the best ones told?
Yeah, so the ones that I think leaders have the easiest time telling are the founding story of the company. And I think the reason is because they almost all know it. Right. You don't get to be a senior executive at a company without knowing where the company came from. And it's been told a lot of times. And plus, it's the one that is the most obviously a story. Right. The founding of the company. It's hard to tell people how your company was founded without telling them a story. But it's easy to tell people what your strategy is without telling them a story. So the founding one, I think, just comes the most naturally to people when they're trying to describe how their company started.
Okay, nice. Okay, so about these stories, I mean, these stories have to come from somewhere. I mean, within the company and stuff like that. How can people who are interested in telling these stories, how do they find these stories? What is the best way for them to get hold of these stories?
Yeah, well, you need to ask for them. So of the people that you work with. So when you start by having a wish list, and that's partly what the 10 stories is supposed to be. These are the most important 10 stories that you probably need to have. So this is your wish list. You should want to go around your company and find 10 stories that fit the need that these 10 stories demand, right?
Right.
So you need to go find your founding story. You need to go find your case for change story. You need to go find and create a vision story. So the way you do that is you walk around with your wish list or send it to people and say, I'm looking for stories that will meet these needs. And ask them questions like, has something like this ever happened to you? Or, when you're trying to create your a story about your customers. Well, you probably need to interview some of your customers. When you're trying to create your sales story, you probably need to talk to somebody in the sales department, right? When you're trying to create your marketing story, you probably need to talk to somebody in the marketing department. So you're going to have to go talk to people and ask questions. And what the book does, there's one chapter, of course, on each of these stories. And in each of those chapters, it explains why that story is important. Then it gives you one example of that story. And then there are tips for how to find exactly that type of story at your company. So, for the chapter on a recruiting story, the last one, the tips at the end tell you to interview some other people you work with and ask them questions like, what made you decide to work here? Or what keeps you here? Or have you ever thought about leaving the company? And if so, what made you stay? Those are the kind of questions that will help surface an interesting story that can serve as your recruiting story. And there's a similar set of questions in each of the chapters to help you find those particular stories.
Nice. Okay, right, got that. Okay, so Paul, let me go a little bit on a sidetrack here. While you're researching for this book, I'm sure you came across a heck of a lot of stories that you could put in. Was there any story that you were researching that you really, really, really want to put in the book, but which you couldn't?
I think if I had to pick an 11th story,
Okay.
yeah, because I've thought a lot about, could it be the 15 or the 20 stories? But the 11th one might be why you should invest in us. And I picked that one because I think there are a lot of smaller mid-sized companies that are trying to grow and they need a venture capital firm to invest in them or a private equity firm, or they want to take the company public or whatever,
Right.
and they need to convince people to invest your money in us, buy stock in the company. And I think that would be a pretty useful story for a lot of companies to have, but not all of my clients and readers are at that stage in their company growth, so that didn't make the top 10, but it might make the second 10 for sure.
Okay, got that. Okay. So, Paul, I mean, storytelling is as you mentioned, it's a means to communicate something. So let's say, let me pose this question for you. Let's say you came across someone who is at odds on how to communicate something, and you had only enough time to tell that person one way in which to communicate. What would be that one thing you tell that person?
So you're saying if they had a really short amount of time, or
Yeah,
you're
like,
just forcing them to choose one
no,
method of communication?
no, like if you had only enough time to tell that person one thing about how to communicate, how to get the message he wants to get out,
Mm.
what would be that one thing you tell that person?
Well, I don't think it would be telling a story. I think if I could only tell somebody one thing about communicating, I think I would just say, be honest.
Mm-hmm.
Say exactly what you mean.
Right.
That's what I try and do. I think storytelling is a very important tool in your communication kit, but it's not the only tool. And if I could only give people one piece of advice in communicating, I think it would be just be honest. And by the way, all the stories that I tell they're honest, true, real stories about real things that happen to real people. So
Right.
I think that's important as well.
All right. Okay. Cool. Got that. Okay. So, Paul, in the last minute or so of this interview, are there any last words of wisdom you'd like to share, maybe to inspire listeners?
Well, I think storytelling is one of those things that people assume mistakenly that if you're not born a really good storyteller, you'll just never be. They think, it's like some people are natural born artists or musicians, and well, if you're not, you're never going to be one. But I don't think any of those things are true, right? If like I'm not a naturally gifted musician, but I'll bet if I wanted to learn to play the guitar, I bet I could. Now, I may never be like the world's best guitar player, but I bet I could learn how to play the guitar.
Right.
But the reason or the way I would do that is I would go take guitar lessons, right? I wouldn't just buy a guitar and sit it by my bed and hope that, by osmosis overnight I would be a guitar player, right?
Right, right.
So think of storytelling the same way. If you want to be a better storyteller, take lessons, right? Take lessons from somebody, that knows what they're doing. Read a book on it, watch a video, take an online course. Consider it a serious, legitimate communication skill and study it. But just deciding to tell more stories and opening your mouth and having stuff come out is usually not the way to learn something that's important.
Right, right. Okay, okay, got that. Cool. Okay then, so in closing, the book is The 10 Stories Great Leaders Tell. The author's our guest, Paul Smith, and you can find his book on Amazon. Oh yeah, Paul, where else might our listeners be able to find you?
Yeah, my website's probably the easiest place. It's got links to all the books and courses I teach and things like that, and it's leadwithastory.com.
Okay, leadwithastory.com. Okay, so go ahead and check it out, people. And Paul, thank you very much for being an author story. I must say I had a great time speaking with you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yes, I enjoyed it as well. Thank you.
Okay, so everyone, check out the 10 stories great leaders tell. And while you're at it, go ahead and subscribe to our channel because I'm sure you'll be able to pick up something on one of the over 100 books and interviews we've already done. So see you guys next time on Author Story, where we speak to another awesome author about their book.